Thank you, Daniela. Thanks to the audience for sticking with us and everyone watching online. So this is no due respect to the senators, this is the panel I was a little more excited about in some ways because now they can really talk. This is our panel. It's our panel of formers, but I call them former practitioners. I called on some people who know how the business of national security works. They've lived it. They've been in the trenches. They've been in the E ring, the seventh floor, the eighth floor, the other seventh floor. They're both seventh, yeah. Up on the hill. I've known most of them. These three I've known a long time. Mary Beth and I are just getting along. But we have we have a chief of staff from CIA and from DOD. We've got two different former assistant secretaries of defense for international affairs. Mika was a HIPSI staffer, worked for Ted Kennedy. She's now kicking butt on MSNBC a lot, keeping tabs on this administration. So I wanted to put it to them about the difficulties, the challenges of doing national security in this environment. And this is an area that we've talked about where we think there's not a whole lot of separation between left and right. It's really about the priorities of what it takes to get things through. So I wanted to kind of walk through from your different perspectives, start very general, and then we'll get to specific issues about the things that are concerning you the most. And when I say that, I think of the policies that are being put forward and the budget that's being put forward for this year. This is a year look-ahead event. What are the challenges that this administration are going to have and why? I'll start right with you, Mary Beth.
Well, I think one of the very first challenges is that while we have a national security strategy and a national defense strategy, with priorities and I think a budget that's robust, it's a little bit difficult for folk to ascertain, okay, so now that we have this, what are we going to be doing? How are we going to implement that? How are we going to prioritize, the resources needed? And from a foreign perspective, we still appear a little bit non-committal in what exactly should I expect from you, U.S. administration, as far as your implementation and next steps on where you're going in Syria, and what are the broader implications of your Iran policy or your Iraq policy when I look to the region, or where are you going, U.S. vis-a-vis Russia? On the one hand, the Russians, the Iranians are working collectively against the remnants of ISIS or the resurgent Al-Qaeda in Syria and in that region. But on the other hand, I see areas where you are definitely at odds, not only with Russia, with its use of poisons and other nefarious activities that have gone unanswered in many European eyes, at least, but also Iran, where you are working with them in Syria and in some cases in Iraq, but terribly afraid of a resurgent Hezbollah and the possible use of the Shia militia in Iraq and on the borders of Israel, and how are you going to move forward with that? And part of that comes from, I think, a couple of things. We haven't always had a messaging that has been consistent across our various government agencies, and that leads to confusion or doubt. Sometimes that can be to your advantage in that it could be one of the reasons why Kim Jong-un may have changed his mind for a presidential meeting. Part of me says I will believe it when I see it. But I think in many cases, it leaves allies somewhat ambiguous as to what your policy goals are, how they should plug into it, who they should speak to, and how they should articulate their either consistencies or inconsistencies. I think the second thing is it's very difficult for other countries to move as relatively quickly as we move, particularly from a kinetic standpoint and from a communication standpoint. And when we appear to be, whether we are or not, in a certain amount of disarray, it's very difficult for them to respond and to get their coalition governments, in most cases, sort of lined up and ready to go so that their political process can dovetail with ours. So I think I'll stop there. I think I've had my fair share.
That's good. And I'll jump to the far end of Jeremy for this question. As former chief of staff to Secretary Panetta, Director Panetta, two different agencies. We see you on TV a lot of talking about the issues of the day with Russia. But think back to your time running agencies, running being part of the Defense Department. When you think of the state of defense this year, where are you at?
Yeah, I'll give you my top line. Is this on? I'll give you my top lines, Kevin. First, I think the chaos that's engulfed the national security team has not engulfed DoD for the most part. And that's because we have very strong civilian leaders at the department, and also because institutionally there's a lot of continuity with the uniformed military. Second, I think a lot of the concerns early on in the administration about the over-militarization of national security policy with a McMaster and a Mattis and a Kelly, those are kind of, I think, have not come true, and that I think was a little bit overstated probably at the beginning. And then a third thing I would sort of put in the positive category is that in terms of defense spending, not only is the budget bigger, but there's more flexibility. And I actually think a bigger budget can be a problem sometimes. The problem with sequestration wasn't that it was a cut, it was that there was no flexibility about where to make the cut. So I think the flexibility is important. So, I think that's all good. Those are sort of my good top lines. The problems that I see, and I hear, frankly, when I talk to folks inside the defense community is, number one is the evisceration of the State Department has been a huge problem for defense, and Mattis has said this more articulately than anybody. If we don't have diplomats on the front lines, we're going to have to backfill with military or political military capability, and that is more expensive and sometimes less effective. Second is the protectionist instinct, including things like tariffs, actually has a material impact on the defense industrial base, and I don't know anybody in industry who believes that protectionism, tariffs, America First economic policies are actually good for the defense industrial base and national policy making. And third is sort of what Mary Beth referenced, which is there's been an overall denigration of allies and alliances, and I know Derek and Mika will talk to this. And look, our alliance system is a key pillar of United States' strength in the world. It sends the wrong signal to our allies, but more importantly to our adversaries when we seem not to have our allies back.
All right, good. So Derek, you mentioned you, and then we'll go to Mika for the next perspective. But Derek, I mentioned earlier, I was at the Brussels Forum with you last week, so we heard a lot from the European perspective. You also worked in the building, if you want to add on to anything that Jeremy and Marybeth have said as well. But so here we are at the beginning of the year-ish still with the state of defense looking forward. What comes to your mind?
Well, first, I want to echo what Jeremy said in that the Defense Department right now is a relative island of stability. That's for a couple reasons. It's because of, I think, Mattis's unique role in Trump's firmament. In terms of the latitude he's been given. It is because of the budget, and the Defense Department now has got the problem of how to spend a lot of money rather than cut across the board. One of the consequences of the pre-delegation of a lot of authorities to the Defense Department, and I would argue kind of an overcorrect from what was perceived as some of the micromanagement of the Obama White House when it came to defense issues. Given the Defense Department a lot of latitude in terms of decision-making. What you're seeing, though, is, of course, the Defense Department being pretty cautious in terms of how it uses that latitude. So I think they're well aware, Secretary Mattis and the uniform leadership are well aware that when it comes to accountability, the White House is going to pre-delegate authority, but is still not going to share accountability if something were to go wrong. So they're pretty cautious. When it comes to our allies and how we're perceived abroad, I think it's a lot of the same conversations I have in foreign capitals as the kinds that we have here, which is trying to figure out what matters. Do we pay attention to tweets, or do we pay attention to Secretary Mattis, or do we pay attention to what Congress say? There's a issue of what is the priority for the United States? Is it the return of geopolitics and the kind of worldview that the national security strategy very eloquently, in my view, stated? Or is it this more nationalist, protectionist perspective that more consistently comes out of the president? And sort of what is it? Now, on the good news side, and I try to find some silver linings here, we do see allies who are, I would argue, selectively listening in some ways, in that they are trying to look for continuity. The reason why I say that's good news is because to me it's a strong demand signal that the United States is a country that folks still want our leadership. They're rather than trying to push us away, they're definitely trying to find things that they can work with. And so when you go to Eastern Europe, for example, you don't hear a lot about the mixed messaging on Russia, which I would argue in sort of more normal times, some of the rhetoric coming out of certainly the White House on Russia would be very concerning. But what they do stress is the continuity. They say, well, look, it's very good that we still have U.S. troops here in the Baltics or in Poland. It's good that President Trump, even though it took a kind of a meandering journey to get there, got to the Article 5 commitment on NATO. So the concern there is that I wonder when this selective listening will start to wear down, and that a year from now, if we were sitting here, allies are saying, well, look, we've sort of put up with this long enough and hoped that some of this would go away, but now we're genuinely concerned about the direction of the United States and the inability of the United States to send a consistent message, which continues these questions that, again, we all face, which is, what are we actually trying to do out there in the world?
When you mentioned the strategies, we're at a point now where we just recently got that guidance and that bit of messaging, and so we're still, in the wake of that, having the policy professionals in place, the strategy in place. So, Mika, from your perspective, either on the alliances and the overseas, or actually coming from the Hill and from in town, where are you with the state of defense right now?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think, to start with the silver lining, as everyone else has, one of the things that I think has happened in this administration is that you've actually discovered a bipartisan consensus around where America's national security should be. And you see a lot of agreement, much less fighting among the people on the Hill. You saw that in the panel earlier this morning between Senator Peters and Senator Ernst about what America's essential role is, the need for a strong national defense, the importance of allies, the very traditional things that American leadership has always stood for. So I think that's really good. The challenge is, I think that consensus doesn't necessarily extend all the way into the White House. And I think that there's a real question about what happens as this president looks at his sort of first team of substitutions and replacements as we move away from Secretary Tillerson, questions on how long Secretary Mattis will stay, possibly replacing H.R. McMaster with John Bolton. We could be in a very different direction as a nation, which, for all the people who are talking about continuity, we're only a year in, and so I don't know that we really know what's going on. The challenge with this administration, I think, and the state of defense and what this means is that, right, as Jeremy knows better than anyone, the Pentagon is an aircraft carrier that is slow to turn in strategic direction, and deliberately so, right? The bureaucrats, the civilians that we have in the Pentagon, like the long-term planning means that it takes a while to change. So that's useful. But the real challenge here is that we have a White House that does not think in those long-term change ways. We have a president who makes up his mind on the fly. He's not necessarily thinking about the strategic implications of the things that he is saying. For example, when we look at North Korea and his agreement to meet with the North Koreans, at the same time we're talking about the rest of Asia walking away from TPP without the Americans. We're looking at tariffs that are going to hit the South Koreans the hardest. We're not seeing the kinds of foreign policy decisions that we would have made that would have been consistent, that would have said, hey, here's what we do on exercises and arms sales and the rest of this, and it all is pulling in the same direction. Now for allies, I think it's very confusing because you may have one policy decision that you like in one direction and another policy decision that you like in another direction. And then the other thing that I think is really challenging about this particular decision on North Korea was the way in which the career bureaucracy, both state, DOD, and the president's own cabinet were taken by surprise. And what that says to the rest of our allies is, look, if you don't like the decision that you're hearing from the people who've done this for a while and who think this thing through, try and get directly to the president, flatter him, and see if you can get that decision reversed. And then let's just see where we go, right? And I think that that's actually very difficult. It's a very difficult environment to be in when consistency and planning and direction and strategic direction matters. The last thing that I will say is, even though we have a national security strategy, when you look out at sort of where the public is on some of these things, public support for a lot of the things that we are doing in national security is very thin. So, for example, when we talk about U.S. counterterrorism operations in Niger, The public doesn't know that we're doing it. And I don't know that we have a national consensus to be operating on counterterrorism as broadly as we are. And to the extent that it costs American lives, you could see a real pullback because the public is generally much more isolationist than the Washington consensus on American leadership.
Mary Beth, you had a question.
I just have a little bump that I want to add to all of this. I think some of us are saying, or actually all of us are saying pretty much the same thing, but I do want to back up and put it a little bit more in context. I mean, we are barely 1 year into an administration that I don't think is really all that far off than the first year of most administrations. If we look back a year ago or into our last administration with Barack Obama's first year, there was a lot of question. He gave some amazing speech, like the Cairo speech, but there was a lot of question regarding follow-through, tremendous amount of questions about to what extent his policies would continue those of George W. Bush. I think we're being a bit harsh. And I think it is a bit of the function of this whirlwind that Washington and the media are in. I think that for a republic that elected a guy who had some very little Washington experience, almost none, and who we knew would be taking a mercantilist, very different approach, most of what we're saying actually is so far so good. We're looking for some specifics, as is the rest of the world, but to call upon all of the things that we talked about as far as priorities, et cetera, and for that to be evolving at this stage, I don't think is atypical, and we may be a little hypercritical at this point.
I have a little different
We have some
view.
we have some squirming on the other side of the
I think
dais.
we are in a unique moment here. I haven't checked my Twitter feed yet. It's only 9:18, but whether anyone's been fired or anything like that, I don't remember that during the first year of the Obama administration. But
First president to use Twitter, though.
Obama was, but in a very different way. I think there are several other people who probably checked that before.
Obama tweeted his March Madness bracket.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
He did.
Exactly. And at least my experience is that this actually gets harder as you go, not easier in administrations. That the first year you're sort of riding on the wave of the election, and there's a sense that you've got some open water and you've got some political space to do some things differently. I think for a lot of reasons, this administration didn't use its first year in ways that in normal times we would see administrations use it. They didn't, because they weren't really well organized. They frankly didn't expect they were going to win, all the things we know. And I just feel as we get into closer to 2020, as we get whatever happens this November, it's going to get harder. And that the president, whether we should pay attention to his tweets or not, I think obviously we should, but you hear a lot of folks trying to say we shouldn't. His disposition, his relatively erratic disposition, is only going to increase as the pressure grows as we head into 2020. So what worries me, getting off the silver lining part of the discussion, is that the chaos and churn that we've seen is only going to get worse as the pressure cooker builds politically.
But Jeremy, to speak to that, because you just said earlier one of the good things is that underneath the chaos, there's an institution that like just specific to DoD or CIA or the IC more broadly that does carry on like an aircraft carrier that's going to do its job, and the international community is relying on that a little bit. We heard that in Brussels from some trying to say, we know the White House is chaotic, but we still have our relationships minister to minister, organization to organization. Some of these policy guys, again, have just gotten into office, just got started. So is that something to look forward to, or is this just, wishful thinking?
Yeah, I mean, Mary Beth has a point in that most administrations take some time to ramp up, get their personnel in place. And if you remember, Obama didn't actually lay out his Afghanistan plan, which was kind of the big issue the first year, until I think December of 2009 with that West Point speech after a very long period of review. The thing that I think is different is that unlike previous presidencies where there was an orderly national security process in which the policy options were reviewed, advice was taken from different corners, intelligence was fused into the process and made part of the baseline of the decision making, and then out came sort of a very deliberate, thought through, carefully coordinated, previewed with allies, previewed with the Hill policy. We have a situation, let's take the North Korea example that Miko referenced. Okay, The South Koreans come to the White House, and the president kind of crashes the meeting. Now, we all know that that could have been orchestrated. That may not be improvisationally done as maybe reported. But the president crashes the meeting, and they propound a request or an invitation. And instead of him saying, okay, you know what? Kim Jong-un wants something. Let's see what we can get out of that. Let's see if we can gain some concessions. He wants to stand next to me. I want to know what he's going to do, and sort of play a little hard to get. The president says, okay, I'm there. Tell me. I'm yours. When can I come? And I think not only did he not consult his professionals, and not only was it chaotically done, it actually could lead to a detrimental bad result, because not only is that not an accomplishment, it's actually a huge concession that we gave to the North Koreans without getting anything in return.
And that's, you think, because of the lack of people around him or structure, or is that just the personality of the president?
It's so deep and complex. But I mean, it's obviously an amalgam of his desire to be theatrical, to seize the moment, to drive the headlines, and also when someone invites me, it's sort of a flattery that he responds to. And I don't think if we could kind of rewind the tape and do it all over again, what's in the best interest of the United States, because that's what we all care about, no matter your party or your approach on these issues. A better approach would have been, thank you very much for the invitation, take that back, huddle with his team, and figure out what can the United States get for this. And that wasn't done. Well,
let's stick on the flattery theme for a second. Derek, it reminds me of, you wrote an article in Defense One that you can all read about I think it was called When the House of Saud Met the House of Trump, and that first meeting when the Saudis came in the beginning of the administration, and the idea that if Trump thinks he can impress with his bling at Mar-a-Lago, wait till he gets a load of what the Saudis bring, and nobody does it like they do. What does that mean when it comes to not just policy, but the actual tactical moves in the Middle East? Deployments, arms sales, agreements, trust in between bilateral relationships, the war in Yemen.
Well, I mean, there's a I call it the Saudi playbook, just because they were the first ones to really use it and they mastered it. But other countries,
they used it on Obama too.
Well, it didn't work as well, perhaps. But in terms of laying it on thick, whether the Japanese successfully did it, the Poles successfully did it during. The French obviously did it so much so that he's going to get his parade at Veterans Day, right?
Thanks, France.
So. And I think that it's not that hard to figure out, and other countries are using it to their advantage. I mean, what's interesting though is, and this gets back to the more of the continuity side of things, is that the mood music has certainly changed in some of these relationships that were pretty rough at the end of the Obama administration. So the mood music's changed, but the substance hasn't changed much. I mean, we haven't really done much differently vis-a-vis our Saudi partners than was done 2 years ago. I mean, there haven't been major arms sales or anything. With the Poles, same thing. I mean, we haven't done much differently. The mood's changed a lot, and the Poles, I was just in Warsaw last week, they feel very good about their relationship with this administration, so much so that they're perhaps overreaching in other areas because they feel as though they have carte blanche. You could perhaps say the same thing with our Saudi partners when it comes to Yemen or the Qatar issue. And so that gets to Jeremy's point that the kind of knock-on effects of some of this where flattery seems to work so well, it seems to be so easy to get in the good graces of particularly this president, that then it leads to behavior that could be ultimately damaging to our interests. And I think that's something that perhaps is not very well thought through in the White House.
Well, let's stick with the Saudi example. There's a movement, there's a bill in the Senate now calling for either greater authority for that operation, for support for the Saudis in Yemen, or get out of it, coming from I think the left. I think it's fair to say from the left side. Yeah. I mean, is that an outcome of that lack of clarity and wanting either someone at the White House has got to stand up and explain why the U.S. needs to be involved in the Yemen war and supporting the Saudis in it?
Yeah, I think that actually the Yemen is a really good example of that, right? We started that very clearly as a counterterrorism mission focused at a threat aimed at us. And as the situation in Yemen has devolved, it's become a support to allies mission, these questions of refueling and combat support to Saudi Arabia. And I think this is what I was talking about earlier about the consensus being very thin on what we should be doing abroad, right? There's this real question, and a lot of people really struggling with, why is the U.S. doing so much in Yemen? We don't really want to be involved in civil wars, especially after our experience in Iraq in 2003. And so there's a real question, I think, and a growing level of concern among policymakers that this, on the Hill, that we're not sure what we're doing here. And in the absence of a strong White House and national security cabinet that is explaining the rationale and why it matters to America that we do these things, right, and can articulate the impact on America, I think that unease and anxiety about these missions is going to just continue to grow.
Yes, you know the region.
I think you're dead on as far as Yemen is concerned, and I think probably underlying almost all of that is a Washington and broader concern that there's no end game in sight for the major players. That it's very unclear what the Saudi and the Emirati and the Houthis and the Iranian goals are, and what impact, if any, because of very limited leverage that the U.S. has, that we can really have on the end result, and therefore what interests are we serving. But I want to go back for 1 second to what Jeremy said, which I think is valid. But I think equally valid is a very different approach on particularly the South Korea issue, with the North Korea issue, excuse me. And that is, since the cessation of hostilities for the last almost 5-6 decades, we have had essentially a very consistent North Korea policy, which arguably, if the goal has been to get North Korea not to have a missile-capable, particularly an interballistic capability that could deposit a nuclear missile on U.S. territory, has failed, or is as close to failing as you'd want to be, other than being underneath it as it lands on you and says, oh, yes, in fact, they could do it. So, and on the one side, you have the left and others arguing very, very persuasively, look, we have to talk to this guy. We know that talking has not slowed down the program. We know that they've lied to us in every circumstance in the past where we have talked. We know that the diplomatic efforts to date have failed because we are where we are, and it's definitely where we didn't want to be. Do something different. And then there's the, the president did something different. He offered for the first time to sit down president to president. Not that. That's not the different we were talking about. I mean, we were very much complaining about any use of kinetic, any red eye or poke in a black eye, or any kinds of effort that wasn't diplomatic, that we've never used, by the way. To date, there has never been a kinetic activity that has given any kind of response to Korean aggression, including the sinking of boats, the kidnapping of personnel, the killing of South Korean and Japanese. Zero. So our consistency has been talking. So you finally have a president that says, okay, I'm willing to do something different, and I'll accept that meeting, by the way. And it's not like he got on a plane the next day. I mean, we've got weeks to talk about what he would get and what the requirements would be and what the positions would be. And oh, by the way, we've been talking about it for 40 years. So I'm not so concerned that he basically pulled an audible, if that's what he did, and said, yeah, I'll take you up on that bet, but now we're going to have a meeting and there's got to be something out of it for both of us. I think we tend to be a little bit of, Monday morning quarterbacking on some of the things that this president does that, yes, are unexpected, and maybe they're not the traditional, let's sit down with the deputies committee and the principals committee. But again, this guy got elected because he didn't want the deep state and he was going to do things differently. And, let's wait and see how that differently turns out on some of these calls.
I would just say on North Korea, to give this administration its due, I do think that this maximum pressure campaign that was saying, hey, let's go around to all of these other smaller countries that are doing business with North Korea and put pressure on them to say, shut down North Korea's activities, is good, right? Administration after administration, going back to the end of the Korean War, it's like this is a problem. North Korea is a pot that has been boiling, and it gets to boiling over, and we take the lid off, and we relieve a little bit of the pressure, but administration after administration, Republican and Democrat alike, have left it on the burner. We've never really addressed it. And the maximum pressure campaign to get North Korea to the table was great. But I think Jeremy's point about okay, now you've gotten them to the table, where do you go from here is the bigger question. I think there are people who think, yes, absolutely, the president has to give diplomacy a chance. I don't think that there's anyone on the left who thinks, no, right, like let's have a kinetic response instead of the talks. So I do think
Certainly not on the left.
Right, certainly not on the left. I mean, there are some people, perhaps with giant mustaches, who might think that that's the right idea. But I don't think that, generally speaking, this is not Kevin. He's got the full beard. It's not just a mustache.
Hey, don't shoot the bearded messenger. Hey.
But I do think that there is this sort of, they have sort of put this as a primary point of concern. And previous administrations have had a lot of other things to deal with. So they were not interested in pulling North Korea off the back burner. It was like, let's just relieve enough pressure so this is not a problem for us. The Clinton administration, the Bush administration, every time North Korea acts up, it's like, all right, let's negotiate with them enough to get this problem under control. But now we're at a very critical point in the technology, and so it's a very different problem.
So, Mary Beth has a good point, and this also came up, I brought it up with the Europeans in Brussels also, that, look, this is who the people elected. They knew, at least, or at least the electoral college elected. I know, I can see Mika give me a look already with side eye. Going, yeah. But this is who we have, and this is how this is going to operate. This is not new. And some people on the sidelines of that forum were telling me, but how do you respond? How do you form policy if you're a foreign government? How do you form relationships when it's so erratic? But so I want to ask you, as you were the practitioners, you were those types who had to do it. Isn't it in a way? I think the message to allies or friends has got to be deal with it. This is the way it's going to be at least the next 3 years, barring something Robert Mueller hasn't told us. This is how it's going to be. This is a president who is going to make these last minute decisions. He's not going to. We don't live in the perfect world that diplomats want, where there are 6 months or a year of bilateral private negotiations before a big announcement, and we get our JFK Khrushchev in Vienna moment. Instead, we got what we got. So, is it really that bad? Can the institutions not keep up with the president?
Sometimes what I tell European or foreign and American audiences, I say, think of the normal policy-making process as a duck on the water, right? We're all moving. The duck's moving along, and underneath the water line is the world we've all lived in, and we all live in, which is the churn, right? And the Trump presidency, in many ways, is an upside-down duck, right? Lots of splashing, misdirection, craziness on the surface. Below the surface, relative stability in some instances, right? We still have troops in Europe. We're still rebalancing to Asia. So the basic sort of thrust of U.S. policy remain the same. Now, the difference is, of course, an upside-down duck doesn't really get anywhere, right? You don't move. There's not a lot of ambition. And of course, it ultimately dies. That's another story. So, but so the question.
Obviously, not a duck hunter.
But
because they actually swim. Some of them. Under the water.
Some. All right. So we could get a whole nother conference on ducks, right? Okay. So, but a lot
get
of
protested by the Baby Duck Coalition outside.
Exactly. But so a lot of folks are saying, well, wait, what do we take seriously? Like, okay, Trump is on one hand taking this idea from South Koreans kind of on a dime to say, let's go talk to the North Koreans, but then. Last night at a fundraiser, or 2 days ago, whenever it was, Washington Post front page today, he's talking about how he's trashing the South Koreans, and he's going to, he thinks the South Korean government's been cheating us for years and all this. So what do we take seriously? Does he like us or not, right? He says that he's going to be really tough on Iran and take it to Iran, but yet he's not really doing much differently in places like Syria where Iran's on the march. So,
but here comes Pompeo.
Well, so this you could argue, and many are just in the last 48 hours, that all right, with some of these personnel changes, you could have more unity in the sense of what the government's doing. You could argue that's a good thing. So now there's consistency. Then we get into the policy discussion of whether these policies actually make any sense. I think from someone sort of formerly in the trenches. What I could say is what my former colleagues are doing is just trying to keep particularly at the Defense Department, keep their heads down, focus on what we're actually doing, which is not in many ways that different than what they were doing a year and a half ago. And when asked, how are things changing, they just say, look, watch what we're doing, don't pay it. And that's where they're saying, don't pay attention to all the noise. Because the test for Trump, this is what's interesting, is that in many ways, he's the most imperial of all of our presidents, right? I mean, he's someone who, sort of dispositionally is very imperial. But if you think of the concept of the imperial presidency, it was about power and control. And he's actually doesn't seem that interested or very adept at actually executing on policy, right? He likes the show, he likes the tweets, he likes to move the news cycle. But when it comes to actually, pulling the levers and driving tough policy decisions, he doesn't show a lot of aptitude for that. He doesn't have a team yet to do that. So what you see from a lot of allies is a socialization of, well, look, okay, he says tariffs, but then look, as this gets sort of worked out, it's not as much that we should be worried about, right? There's going to be all these carve-outs. So, he says he's gonna really hold NATO's feet to the fire, but he's actually not going to change much. So that's another danger, which is they start to just discount what the president says. And so the irony is the most imperial of presidents could undermine the power of the presidency.
I'll agree to disagree with Mary Beth on whether or not agreeing to the meeting on the spot was a good tactical move, but I think I'll agree with her that I hope it works out, and I hope it is smart strategically. But just pivoting to some other areas, because I do want to point out at least two areas where I think the president's decision-making ended in a correct result. One where I think he did have to buck the bureaucracy and kind of the establishment, and that was moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. I think a lot of people at the State Department and the intelligence community predicted blood in the Arab street and said there'd be chaos, and that kind of didn't happen. And I think it was, in terms of content, a correct move to say that, hey, Israel has its Knesset, its Supreme Court, its Prime Minister's office in Western Jerusalem. We have our consulate there. No biggie if we actually just change the consulate to an embassy. We do that in every other country. That's fine. And I think it's worked out well. The other area where I think the policy has worked out well is the intensification of the counter-ISIS campaign. Many of us were calling for, when the administration came in, sort of largely continuity from what Obama and Secretary Carter had been undertaking. Again, you have some of the same cast of characters on the uniform military side, like the Joe Votels, the Tony Thomases of the world. And I think what essentially we did under Secretary Mattis was sort of intensify what we were already doing, and it has yielded an important result in denying ISIS its physical caliphate in Syria. And I think that's good. And frankly, I don't think the administration gets enough credit for sort of finishing up a lot of the work that had been done.
Yeah, but that decision was another chaotic thing where the president came in saying, we need to get out of these wars, but also we got to go kick ISIS ass.
Yeah,
and you ended up with the latter, not the former.
And I think they
which is
prevailed
not
on
what
him.
Americans want.
They prevailed in him to listen, and partly to Derek's point, it shows the power and authority of a guy like Jim Mattis. But there has been one big policy issue we haven't touched on yet where I think the president's approach has been profoundly wrong, and that is on the issue of Russia. Because even if you put aside everything about the election meddling and the Mueller investigation, Russian forces attacked U.S. forces in Syria on February 7th. Russia has tried to assassinate in the streets of London an individual who the United States helped win his freedom in 2010. I was at the CIA when then Director Panetta and Bob Mueller did the investigation that found the Russian illegals and then did a spy swap for those 4 alleged spies who were in Russian prison. This wasn't like we got an asset out of the country and they came running after their asset. This was a spy swap. This was kind of done above board. There truly is no honor among thieves anymore. And I think we've been obsequious to Putin with regards to Syria. We've let him work his will. We've been obsequious with regards to Putin with regards to Ukraine. And I think it has caused a lot of consternation among NATO allies. And I think it's profoundly the wrong approach for the United States.
Mary Beth, please chime in now. We're going to move to Russia and spy talk a little bit.
This one's easy. Jeremy has it right on both. I think it's extremely difficult for Americans and anybody to understand our position on Russia. I think as a nation, the targeted killings, which is just not the first or the last, the continuing Ukraine and Georgian and Baltic aggressions that we don't talk about as much anymore because they've become so routine, which is a horrible recognition of a state of affairs that should not be. I think it's very difficult to understand the president's inability or unwillingness thus far to call out Russia on its misdeeds. You know, early administrations, Democratic and Republican, have tried to reset or have reached out. I've sat through, in my CIA days, a plethora of approaches, but I don't recall it ever, other than the possibility of arguments on the third site regarding the Czechs and the Polish. But everybody was well behaved above the board then. I think this is as worst, at least in my lifetime, as it has gotten, and our failure to articulate that coherently is disturbing.
And Russia and their aggression brings us to another issue that I think is a real challenge for this administration, and that's cybersecurity, right? When you look at the way that Russia is treating Ukraine as its proving ground in terms of cyber attacks, in terms of grid disruption, electronic warfare, disinformation, all of it, right? Russia is testing its techniques that it wants to use against anyone else in Ukraine. They have started using them in the U.S. That was part of Mueller's indictment of the 13 Russians who were engaged here in the United States. And what we see is, even though I think in the national security strategy, the administration correctly identified and spoke about cybersecurity at great length, greater than we've seen before, we still don't have a cybersecurity strategy. And you saw 13 senators writing to the president about the lack of cyber doctrine, the lack of understanding of what we can do on third-party networks, what is DoD supposed to do in response. You saw this in hearing testimony where Admiral Rogers says, I don't have the authorities that I need to disrupt attacks at the source. We are the most vulnerable nation on cyber, right? Michael Solmeyer says we have the best rocks and live in the glassiest house. We have the most to lose. And at the same time, we don't have a good articulation of cyber that our adversaries or our allies understand. And I think that this administration, given this White House, given its approach to things, will have a hard time developing and building consensus for a strategic approach on cybersecurity.
So, well, yeah, but we've heard that for a long time, and now we have a new cyber commander coming in. But not just it's not that we don't have a cyber guidance from the White House, but what about this question of, the basic question on Russia, on Trump, which is why won't this president go there with the Russians? I mean, what is your hunch, Jeremy or Mary Beth? Why the president won't? Is it as simple as Mueller must have something on him? Is it something else?
I'll start. I mean, again, I must live in a vacuum of time that constantly interferes with my thinking. But I recall at one point in time, I was an advisor to NATO under General Breedlove, and there was a very long period of time in other administrations, including in the last one, where we were extremely reluctant to call the foreign fighters in the Ukraine what they were. They were Russian-trained militants. They were Spetsnaz and other units that were pretending to be either local or regionally Russian separatists or whatever it was. Come on, we all knew what they were, and publicly we went months, if not a year or so, before we even sort of admitted to the fact that they were Russians. And these were Russians fighting on Ukrainian soil, and we were ignoring it. We also went through a reset position in which Russian violation some of its international obligations on nuclear missiles, which had been abrogated or abandoned or breached. We didn't want to talk about those either. And then there's the infamous, once I'm reelected, I'll do better for you. We can make this reset work. I mean, so it's not the first time that we've had a president that has been communicating to Russia in ways that should have made and maybe did make our skin crawl a bit. Does that justify it? No. Does that make it any more understandable? No. I think we've even had people say, Russia's our biggest enemy. Well, I like your 1980s foreign policy back. We're schizophrenic in this country about Russia. We are. And we've got a president who's lagging behind, probably not too different than previous presidents. And the fact of the matter is our leadership writ large, including the White House, needs to figure out what our Russian policy is, articulate it. And I think people in this room encourage them that this is an enemy that is getting away with murder, literally, and is a long-term strategic enemy, and it must feel the pain of its aggressions and transactions, and it needs to feel it sooner rather than later.
So on that, we're within 5 minutes. I want to let's get right to the news of this week of Pompeo being put up for chief diplomat, and the idea of the head of CIA, a man with limited experience, but some experience and some political controversy taking over with all that we've talked about. Are you concerned with it? Are you okay with it? There seems to be depending on who you ask, either this guy is a consummate professional that the operators have really started to like and they like his support, or he's a political hack who's too close to Trump and is a Tea Partier who's going to get the world in a lot more trouble than it's already in. Where are you? Yeah, let's. I'll ask Jeremy on the end.
I think Director Pompeo would make a good Secretary of State. I think he knows the issues. He's been traveling around the world, meeting with foreign leaders, and most importantly, has the confidence of the president. And a lot of the work of intelligence agencies, it's not really reported, but a lot of it is being a diplomat. You're kind of a liaison. You're working these important liaison relationships. So I think he's got the credentials and, very importantly, the relationship to succeed in that job.
Look, Director Pompeo has gotten high marks for his management of the CIA, and that's often not a very easy task to do that well. So that's to his credit. However, prior to that, his most notable role in national security was as one of the leaders on the Benghazi committee, the Benghazi investigation. He believed that the final report, was not hard enough on Secretary Clinton, the State Department, that he had to go and write an annex to, that was went further in terms of the harshness. In my view, that entire circus, the Benghazi investigation, did more to undermine the Department of State, make it more risk averse, less willing to do the kind of forceful diplomacy, brave diplomacy that we need, that Secretary Mattis talks about all the time. That whole thing did more damage to the department than almost anything in the last few years. Now he's going to be leading that department. So I'll be very interested to see, how he tries to manage a culture that's extremely risk averse, given a lot of what we saw in Benghazi. And then finally, on substance, and this gets back to Russia. On the one hand, we could see him be more closely aligned to the president on certain issues, and that could be a good thing because at least when foreign interlocutors hear from him, they know that he's speaking for the White House. But then there's certain issues I'm not sure how it's going to shake out. What we've heard so far in terms of Russia with the director in the limited public events he's done is that he is probably with the consensus, certainly in this room and in this town, on Russia. In terms of his skepticism of cooperation with Putin, his concern about Russia's behavior in Europe and around the world. So that he's now playing a very different role. He's not behind the scenes in the Oval Office every morning privately advising the president. He's going to be publicly out there articulating policies that we would expect are going to be at variance with what the president will still say and think about Russia. And it could be that we, his time as a close, trusted advisor of Trump, also, we find out it has a shelf life.
On Pompeo, I think there's sort of two real positives to him. One is that he is a trusted advisor of the president. So I think unlike Secretary Tillerson, when he says something, I think people will have more confidence that he is, in fact, carrying the word of the White House. And the second thing is I think he has demonstrated at CIA and starting at State that he will do what Jeremy and Secretary Panetta did, which is that you really have to go in and make allies of your workforce. You have to really understand your agency's mission and make sure that you are right on that team and that you are doing well with that. So I think that those are two positives for him. The real question, I think, for Pompeo is that, and you'll see this when he comes through his confirmation, the senators are looking for people who will stand up to the president, who is erratic and sort of we talked about this sort of, right, the axis of grown-ups, right? And they want people who are going to be helping the president control his more impulsive instincts and serve as a check on him. And I think that you saw this in the confirmation hearings for a lot of the first round of appointees where they were asking this question over and over again, when will you stand up to the president? How will you stand up to the president? And this is a director of the CIA, and as he demonstrated on Benghazi, as someone who's more of an enabler than he is as a check. And so I think this will be interesting as he comes out into the public. Senators have a chance to ask him about his record at CIA and ask him about his ability to really advise the president and make the president think differently about some of his policy choices. And so I look forward to those hearings.
I'll agree with my colleague that the epitome of a new guy into the building who did amazingly well in all aspects was Jeremy. and Secretary Panetta, being accomplished and being successful at CIA. I spent almost 13 years there under covert, and then 5 years in DOD, is really getting to the workforce and understanding what they did. And Panetta was extremely successful, and a lot of other more experienced people failed. Dave Petraeus is probably one of the people that I think arguably had the most difficult time, both externally and particularly internally. So I think this particular director will be phenomenal. He does have the president's confidence over at state. He's demonstrated the fact that he can go into a really diverse workforce that feels pretty badly about where they are in the scheme of things, and not only be successful, but be successful within the workforce. I don't think it will be the new Secretary of State's job to confront the president and to be a check on him. I think that adds to the chaos that we all started this conversation about. Providing advice and consent behind the scenes, that is his job, but his job is to execute the president's policy, and if he disagrees with it, and he then resigns. So I differ just a bit there.
Oh, it's more about what the senators are looking for in the process of confirmation.
Yeah,
than
but
how he
the
is.
senators aren't the kings of the State Department. I get in the confirmation process, they get their chance to ask questions, but that's just their role from the advice and consent of the Senate. I don't think that's a role that the Secretary of State nor this Secretary of State will play.
So in a 51-49 Senate with one Republican senator who's already said he will oppose Pompeo, I do think he has to listen to the senators.
So we're at the end of our time, but I wanted to try to wrap us up. We are Defense One, that's the state of defense. So what does this mean for G.I. Joe and Jane out in the field, for the Lance Corporal, for the warrant officer, for the one-star who's trying to do their job and make sense of all of this? And a very short answer: should they be hopeful? Should they be concerned? What should they be thinking?
I'll give you a one-word answer. What it means for people who are on the front lines defending our freedom: nothing. If you talk to troops in the field, people working in the Pentagon, they pretty much have their nose down and they're working hard on their problem set. They still have a very hard job. It's a dangerous world, and we need them to keep doing it.
I totally agree with that. The one caveat I would make overall is, and this is something I think hopefully the chairman, the Secretary Mattis, and others will have frank conversations with the president about: no political rallies with the troops. What happened in California a few days ago was unacceptable, right? If the President of the United States is going to go before our men and women in uniform and talk about fake news and use it as a political rally, that's a very, very dangerous thing. And I would hope that Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, who have a tremendous amount of credibility with this president, will have very, very frank conversations with him about that.
My advice to the troops would be, right, as Jeremy said, keep your head down, but also turn off cable news, right? In any place where cable news is on, Fox, CNN, doesn't matter what channel, just turn it off, because the day-to-day churn is gonna, it takes a toll on so many people. Just turn it off, do your jobs.
Except when these guys are on, right? Isn't that
The
wisdom is there.
No, just turn it off. You can turn it on at home. Jeremy and I are on sometimes in prime time. That's fine, but during the day, just turn it off.
And the final word.
I don't disagree with anything that my colleagues said, but our troops, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, reservists, et cetera, know that we love them. As long as they are secure in that, and they'll continue to do their jobs just as always.
Well, I think that's a telling closing of everything we talk about, and all the fret and all the churn and all the worry. The practitioners have a whole different, set of priorities, and they are out there doing that. And I see it when I go out in the field and travel with people like Votel, or go to these international conferences like Brussels, and I know you guys do too. Thank you for this discussion. It's what I had hoped for, a real insight from actual practitioners who know what it takes to get these jobs done. And it's not just any job; it really is national security. Thank you to our panel, please.